Hello and welcome. Find a comfortable space. Let the noise and haste of your world fall away. And join me on a journey. A journey back in time, back to the grimy, gaslit, and glorious heart of 19th century London. A city of staggering wealth and soul-crushing poverty, of grand imperial ambition and quiet, desperate suffering. A city built on foundations of iron and coal, and in many ways a city fueled and fortified by beer. Tonight we are going to tell the story of a disaster. But this is not one of the grand epic calamities that dominate the history books. This is not a story of a great fire that consumed a city, or a devastating plague that emptied its streets, or a bloody battle that decided the fate of a nation. This is a story about a disaster so strange, so improbable, so utterly bizarre. It sounds like something from a satirical novel by Dickens or a darkly comedic folktale. It's a story about a flood. But it wasn't the gray, murky water of the River Thames that burst its banks and swept through the streets, destroying homes and taking lives. It was beer. A massive, dark, churning, foaming wave of porter, unleashed from a ruptured brewery tank, creating a literal tsunami of alcohol that crashed through one of London's poorest and most wretched neighborhoods. This is the true story of the London beer flood of 1814. At first, the very idea strikes the modern ear as almost comical. A river of beer flowing through the streets? It sounds like a drunkard's daydream, the setup for a joke. But the reality was anything but amusing. For the people who lived and died in the shadow of the Great Moo Brewery, this bizarre event was a terrifying, destructive, and ultimately lethal force. It was a strange disaster that rips away the romantic veneer of Georgian London, and exposes the brutal, precarious reality of life for the urban poor. It's a story that reveals the staggering, almost terrifying industrial scale of the nation's favorite drink. Tonight, we will peel back the layers of this extraordinary event. We will become historical archaeologists, digging through the strata of time to understand the world that made such a catastrophe possible. We'll explore the sprawling, chaotic metropolis of 19th century London, a city at the very dawn of the Industrial Revolution, grappling with unprecedented growth and social upheaval. We'll step inside the immense breweries of the era, which were not quaint workshops but smoke-belching factories, cathedrals of fermentation, and marvels of early industrial engineering that held veritable seas of beer in colossal vats. We will walk the narrow, filthy streets of the St. Giles Rookery, a place of unimaginable poverty and squalor, and we will meet the unfortunate souls who lived there, whose lives were about to be violently and surrealistically upended. And then we will stand by, in our historical imagination, on that fateful October afternoon. We will witness the moment a single overworked iron hoop failed, unleashing over 1 million pints of beer in a destructive, unstoppable torrent. We will follow the dark wave of destruction as it smashes through tenement buildings, floods crowded cellars, and traps its victims in a sticky, suffocating tide. And we will examine the tragic aftermath, the grim recovery of the dead, the coroner's inquest, and the strange legal verdict that declared this entirely man-made catastrophe to be, of all things, an act of God. This is a deep dive into a piece of weird history that is at once tragic, absurd, and profoundly illuminating. It's a story that reveals the hidden dangers of unchecked industrialization and shines a light on the forgotten lives of those who lived and died in its shadow. So pour yourself a drink, perhaps a pint of porter, if you're so inclined, to honor the fallen, and join me as we explore the great, the terrible, and the utterly bizarre London beer flood. Part 1. The City of Contrasts. Chapter 1. The Leviathan City. To understand how a flood of beer could even happen, let alone become a lethal event, we must first immerse ourselves in the city that birthed it. London in 1814 was a monster. A sprawling, breathing, chaotic leviathan. It was, without question, the largest and richest city in the world, the undisputed hub of a burgeoning global empire. Its population had recently surpassed 1 million people, making it the first modern city to do so. It was a place of dizzying energy and stark, brutal contrasts. The year 1814 was a moment of supreme national confidence. The long, grueling Napoleonic Wars, which had pitted Great Britain against France for over 2 decades, were nearing their end. Napoleon Bonaparte had abdicated and been exiled to the island of Elba just a few months earlier. The final bloody victory at Waterloo was still 8 months away, but a triumphant peace seemed assured. Britain stood on the cusp of becoming the world's sole superpower, a position it would hold for the next century. This was the dawn of the Pax Britannica. The wealth of the world flowed through London. The docks along the Thames were a dense, tangled forest of masts, as ships arrived daily from every corner of the globe. They carried sugar and rum from the Caribbean, tobacco and cotton from America, tea and porcelain from China, and nutmeg and cloves from the far-off spice islands of Indonesia. The city's financial district, the ancient square mile, was inventing modern capitalism. In the trading rooms of the Royal Exchange and the noisy coffee houses of Threadneedle Street, fortunes were made and lost on the price of commodities, the value of stocks, and the security of government bonds. In the grand squares of the West End in Mayfair, St. James's, and Bloomsbury, the wealthy aristocracy and the newly rich merchant class lived in elegant, symmetrical Georgian townhouses. This was the London we see in the novels of Jane Austen and the drawings of Thomas Rowlandson, a world of refinement and decorum, of lavish balls and gaslit ballrooms, of private clubs on Pall Mall, and of fashionable promenades in Hyde Park, where ladies showed off their latest bonnets and gentlemen their fine horses. It was a world of immense privilege, built on the profits of empire and industry. But this elegant world was an island, surrounded by a vast dark sea of poverty. Just a short walk from the pristine squares and manicured parks lay another London. A dark, crowded, teeming and desperate London. This was the London of the Industrial Revolution. A city grappling with social changes more rapid and profound than any in human history. The population was exploding. Enclosure acts in the countryside had pushed thousands of rural families off the land. They poured into London, seeking work in the new factories, workshops, and breweries that were springing up across the city. They were crammed into sprawling, squalid slums or rookeries, as they were then called. These were dense, labyrinthine mazes of narrow, unlit, unpaved alleys, lined with decaying multi-story tenement buildings that were packed from cellar to attic with families, often with multiple families sharing a single squalid room. There was no sanitation to speak of. The concept of a public sewage system was still decades away. Human waste, along with garbage and the offal from slaughterhouses, was simply thrown into the streets or into overflowing cesspits in the cellars. The streets were thick with the foul-smelling mud, a mixture of dirt, horse manure and human excrement. The water, drawn directly from the heavily polluted Thames or from shallow, contaminated wells, was a vector for diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. In these conditions, life for the urban poor was, as the philosopher Thomas Hobbes had written 2 centuries earlier, nasty, brutish, and short. It was a world of relentless hard labor for pitiful wages, of gnawing hunger, of staggering child mortality rates, and of constant, grinding, inescapable poverty. Chapter 2: The River of Beer. And in this world of squalor and toil, there was one ubiquitous essential solace. One cheap and readily available escape from the misery of daily life. One thing that provided calories, a measure of safety from tainted water, and a temporary oblivion from pain and sorrow. That escape was beer. In 18th and 19th century London, beer was not simply a recreational beverage as we think of it today. It was a fundamental, essential part of the daily diet, especially for the working class. It was, in a very real sense, liquid bread. For a laborer doing backbreaking work in the docks or on a construction site, a quart of beer a day was a vital source of calories, often making the difference between sustenance and starvation. Furthermore, in an age before reliable water purification, beer was often the safest thing to drink. The brewing process involved boiling the water, which killed most of the harmful bacteria that cause waterborne diseases. A pint of beer was frequently cleaner and safer than a cup of water from the local pump. This fact was well understood. Hospitals gave beer to their patients. The Army and Navy issued daily beer rations to their soldiers and sailors. Employers frequently paid their workers in part with beer, or provided beer allowances as part of the daily wage, a practice known as truck. Beer was the social lubricant of the city. London's thousands of pubs, alehouses, and gin palaces were the living rooms of the poor. They were places to find warmth, light, and companionship, a refuge from the cold, dark, and overcrowded tenements. But beer was also, quite simply, a food. And the beer of choice for the London masses, the undisputed king of beverages, was porter. Porter was a dark, heavy, and bitter beer, first developed in London in the early 18th century. Its origins are a bit murky, but the most popular story is that it was created by blending several different types of beer to create a brew with a rich, complex flavor. Its name is said to come from its immense popularity with the city's porters, the street porters, market porters, and river porters, the men who did the heavy lifting that kept the city's commerce moving. Porter was perfect for the London market. It was cheap to produce. It was nutritious. And its strong, roasted, almost coffee-like flavor, which came from using highly kilned brown malt, was good at masking any off-taste from less than perfect brewing or storage conditions. It was a robust, forgiving beer. The demand for porter was immense, almost unbelievable to modern minds. And to meet this insatiable demand, the London breweries had to industrialize. They were at the very forefront of the Industrial Revolution. They transformed from small-scale craft operations, brewing a few barrels at a time, into massive smoke-belching factories of beer production. Brewers like Samuel Whitbread, Harry Truman, and Barclay Perkins became the industrial titans of their day, the 18th century equivalent of today's tech billionaires. They pioneered the use of steam engines to pump water and move grain. They employed chemists to standardize their processes, and they invested heavily in new technologies to scale up their production. And the brewery at the heart of our tragic and bizarre story was one of the largest and most famous of them all. The Horseshoe Brewery, owned by the company Moo & Company. Chapter 3. The Temple of Porter. The Horseshoe Brewery was a landmark of industrial London. It was located on Tottenham Court Road, at its intersection with New Street. Today, this is a bustling area of theaters, restaurants, and electronics shops in the heart of the West End. The Grand Dominion Theatre now stands on the former site of the brewery. But in 1814, this was a geographical and social fault line. To the east and north lay the respectable middle-class squares of Bloomsbury. But to the south and west lay the notorious slum known as the Street Giles Rookery. The brewery itself was an awe-inspiring sight. It was a sprawling complex of brick buildings, covering several acres, dominated by towering chimneys that belched black coal smoke into the London sky. The air for blocks around was thick with the sweet, malty, almost bready smell of brewing. It was a place of constant noise and activity, the rumble of machinery, the shouting of workers, the clatter of horse-drawn drays carrying barrels of porter to the city's pubs. And the heart of the brewery, its inner sanctum, was its fermentation house. Inside this vast building were the vats. And we must be clear, these were not the barrels or casks you might imagine. These were colossal wooden vats, some of the largest man-made containers in the world at the time, true titans of the cooper's art. To keep up with the city's insatiable thirst for porter, and because porter required a long aging process to develop its characteristic flavor, the brewers had to store immense quantities of it. They needed to age the beer for months, sometimes up to a year. To do this efficiently, they built vats of a staggering, almost unbelievable size. These were vast, cylindrical containers, constructed from massive staves of Baltic fir or oak, some measuring 3 inches thick. These staves were held together, like a giant's barrel, by a series of immense iron hoops, each one forged by a blacksmith and weighing hundreds of pounds. These vats were so large that they were often tourist attractions. Visitors to London would pay to tour the great breweries, just to stand at the base of these wooden mountains and marvel at the scale of the operation. The vat that would become the villain of our story was a true behemoth. It stood in the main fermentation house of the Horseshoe Brewery. It was 22 feet high. Its diameter was over 60 feet at its base. It was filled with 135,000 imperial gallons of porter, which was in the final stages of its year-long fermentation. That's over 1 million pints of beer. The weight of the dark, fermenting liquid inside it would have been over 600 tons. It was an industrial monster, a wooden ocean of dark, yeasty, potent beer, held in check only by the strength of its timber and the integrity of its iron rings. And this colossal vat, this monument to industrial brewing, stood directly adjacent to the crowded, flimsy tenements of the St. Giles Rookery. The brewery, a symbol of London's industrial might and commercial success, loomed over one of its most wretched and impoverished neighborhoods. The people who lived in these crumbling brick houses, built on the cheap with poor materials, were mostly Irish immigrants. They had fled the crushing poverty and political oppression of their own land, only to find a different kind of misery in the back alleys of London. They lived in damp, crowded cellars and rickety garrets. Their lives literally lived in the shadow of this great beer factory. They could likely hear the constant rumble of the machinery through their thin walls, smell the brewing on the air day and night, and perhaps even feel the vibrations from the brewery's operations through the very ground beneath their feet. They had no idea that the source of the city's favorite drink, the factory next door, was about to become the instrument of their destruction. They were living next to a ticking time bomb, and they didn't even know it. Part 2: The Deluge. Chapter 4. The Sound of Snapping Iron. The date was Monday, October 17, 1814. It was a cool, unremarkable autumn afternoon. The sky over London was likely its usual shade of gray, tinged with the smoke from 1 million coal fires. Inside the Horseshoe Brewery, the daily routine was underway. Workers were mashing grain, boiling the wort and cleaning barrels, the air thick with steam and the familiar, comforting smell of the brew. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, a brewery storehouse clerk named George Crick was doing his rounds. Crick was a diligent, experienced employee. One of his duties was to check the state of the great vats in the main storeroom. As he was walking past the 22-foot-high porter vat, the giant of the brewery, he noticed something amiss. One of the massive iron hoops that cinched the wooden staves together had slipped from its position. This was not a small ring. This was a band of iron that weighed, by itself, nearly 700 pounds. The immense pressure from the 600 tons of fermenting beer inside was causing the wooden walls of the vat to bulge outwards in the weakened spot. Crick was not overly alarmed. This sort of thing happened from time to time. The vats were under constant, immense strain, and the technology was, by modern standards, primitive. Maintenance was an ongoing battle against the forces of physics and fermentation. He calmly made a note of the slipped hoop in his logbook. He found his superior, a Mr. Hawes, and reported the issue. He suggested that a letter be sent to Mr. Young, the brewery's chief partner, to get permission to have the vat maker come and repair it. The response he received was one of casual indifference. Mr. Hawes told him not to worry about it. "No harm will come of it," he reportedly said. It was a small maintenance issue, a problem that could be dealt with tomorrow, or the day after. George Crick, having done his duty, went about his other tasks. He had no idea that tomorrow would be far too late. He had just witnessed the first silent symptom of a catastrophic failure. An hour passed. The workers began to finish their shifts. The light outside began to fade. At approximately 5:30 p.m., George Crick was in another part of the brewery, likely in the counting house. Suddenly, the entire building was rocked by a tremendous explosion. It was not a muffled thud. It was a deafening, terrifying roar. A sound that witnesses later compared to a cannonade, or a clap of thunder directly overhead. The ground shook violently. The brewery walls trembled. Anyone inside the building was thrown off their feet. The weakened iron hoop had finally given way. The 600 tons of pressure inside the vat, the equivalent of several atmospheres, were unleashed in a single explosive instant. The colossal vat didn't just leak or split. It burst apart with the force of a bomb. The initial explosion was powerful enough to demolish the rear wall of the brewery, a solid brick wall that was 2.5 feet thick. It was reduced to rubble in a heartbeat, and through the newly created breach, a tidal wave of beer, a 15-foot-high dark, foaming, churning, unstoppable torrent of warm, fermenting porter was unleashed upon the unsuspecting world outside. The wave, now carrying with it the rubble of the brewery wall and the splintered 3-inch thick staves of the giant vat, smashed into the other containers in the fermentation house. The chaos multiplied. Several other large casks and vats were stove in by the force of the initial blast and the wave of liquid, adding their own contents to the flood. In total, an estimated 323,000 imperial gallons of beer, that's over 2.5 million pints, surged out of the brewery and into the narrow, crowded streets of the St. Giles Rookery. Chapter 5: The Dark Wave. For the residents of New Street, George Street, and the surrounding courts and alleys, there was no warning. There was only the sudden apocalyptic roar and then darkness. One moment they were in their homes, in the fragile domesticity of their lives. Mothers were preparing meager evening meals of bread and potatoes. Children were playing on the dirt floors. Men were sleeping off a long day's labor before heading out to the pub. The next moment, their world was consumed by a dark, suffocating wave. The force of the beer tsunami was immense, far greater than a simple flood of water. Beer is denser than water, and this wave was not just liquid. It was a slurry of debris, carrying jagged pieces of wood and heavy bricks that acted like battering rams. It crashed into the flimsy brick walls of the tenement houses on New Street, directly behind the brewery. These buildings, constructed on the cheap with poor mortar and shallow foundations, stood no chance. The foundations were washed away. Walls buckled and then collapsed inwards. 2 houses on New Street were completely demolished, their structures crumbling as if made of sand. In the cellar of one of these houses, a group of people had gathered for a wake. In the grim reality of the St. Giles Rookery, death was a constant companion. They were mourning the death of a 2-year-old boy, John Seville, who was due to be buried the next day. The mourners, all of them Irish immigrants, included the boy's grieving mother and Seville. They were gathered in the cramped, subterranean room, sharing stories and perhaps a glass of gin to numb the pain. Suddenly, the wall of their cellar burst inwards. They were engulfed by the flood. The room filled with the dark, warm, yeasty beer in a matter of seconds. There was no time to escape, no time even to scream. The heavy liquid would have been impossible to swim in, thick with mud and debris. And Seville, who had just lost her young son, was now killed alongside 4 other mourners. The victims were Mary Mulvey, a 30-year-old woman, and her 3-year-old son Thomas. Also killed were 2 other women, Ann Butler and Elizabeth Smith. A 5th mourner, Hannah Bamfield, a 4-year-old girl who had been visiting with her mother from next door, also perished in the cellar. In the Tavistock Arms pub, which stood adjacent to one of the collapsed houses, the landlady was in the cellar below the pub, cleaning pots. Her young barmaid, a 14-year-old girl named Eleanor Cooper, was working with her. The beer flood, having smashed through the neighboring house, burst through the pub's cellar wall. Eleanor was trapped by the rising tide and the collapsing rubble. She drowned in the beer she was employed to serve. The wave of destruction continued its path, no longer a 15-foot-high tsunami, but a powerful churning river of porter several feet deep, flowing through the narrow streets. It poured into other cellars, the subterranean homes of the poorest of the poor. The pressure of the flood was so great that it was impossible for those inside to open their doors, which typically opened inwards. People were trapped in their basement homes as the dark, sticky liquid rose around them, extinguishing their candles and plunging them into a terrifying, suffocating blackness. Sarah Bates, a mother, was in her basement room with her child when the flood hit. She was also drowned, her body found later amidst the wreckage. The final victim was Catherine Butler, a 65-year-old widow who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, swept away by the current in the street. The scene in the immediate aftermath was one of utter chaos and terror. People were screaming, crying, and scrambling to get to the upper floors of the buildings that were still standing. The air was thick with the powerful, sweet, sickly smell of porter, a smell that would hang heavy over the neighborhood for weeks, a constant grim reminder of the tragedy. It was mixed with the choking dust from the collapsing buildings. The ground was littered with the bodies of drowned cats and chickens, and the floating pathetic debris of people's meager worldly possessions: a wooden chair, a child's doll, a piece of cloth. Chapter 6. A Macabre Carnival. Those who survived the initial wave, those who had managed to climb out of the flood's path, were now faced with a new and surreal horror. The streets and cellars of their neighborhood were waist-deep in beer. And as news of the disaster spread like wildfire through the city's grapevine, a different kind of crowd began to gather. Hundreds of people from the surrounding neighborhoods, hearing the commotion and smelling the unmistakable scent of free beer, flocked to the scene. But not all of them came to help. Some came simply to gawk, to witness the spectacle of destruction, a form of disaster tourism that was common in the 19th century. But many came for the free beer. In a society where a pint of porter was a cherished commodity, the sight of a river of it flowing through the streets was an irresistible temptation. People began scooping up the porter from the gutters with any container they could find: pots, pans, hats, even their own cupped hands. In the midst of the death and destruction, a macabre drunken carnival began. This has led to a persistent and grimly ironic myth about the London beer flood, that one of the victims died not from drowning or injury, but from acute alcohol poisoning, after drinking himself to death from the free-flowing booze. This story appears in many later accounts and adds a layer of dark comedy to the tragedy. However, there is no contemporary evidence from the coroner's inquest or the newspaper reports of the time to support it. The official causes of death for all 8 victims were drowning, injury from the collapsing buildings, and suffocation. The story of the 9th victim, dead from drink, is likely a piece of urban folklore that grew up around the event, a moralizing tale about the depravity of the poor. But the documented reality was grim enough. The brewery workers, to their credit, acted quickly. Once they recovered from the initial shock and realized what had happened, they, along with other neighbors, rushed to help the victims. They waded into the beer-filled streets, pulling people from the rubble and breaking down doors to rescue those trapped in the flooded cellars. The community, at least the sober part of it, rallied. The bodies of the dead were recovered from the wreckage and laid out in a nearby courtyard for their grieving families to identify. It was a scene of profound grief and loss, made all the more surreal by the chaotic, drunken crowds that still swirled around the edges of the disaster zone. The aftermath of the flood was a scene of utter devastation. The Street Giles Rookery, already a place of squalor, was now a wreck. The smell of stale beer, which quickly soured in the autumn air, hung heavy over the neighborhood for weeks. The homes that were still standing were uninhabitable, their walls soaked, their contents ruined. Hundreds of people were left homeless, having lost the few possessions they owned. In the days that followed, they had to rely on the charity of the local parish church, St. Giles in the Fields, and public subscriptions that were set up to provide them with food and emergency shelter. The great brewery, the engine of this destruction, suffered a significant financial loss from the destroyed beer, a loss estimated at around £23,000, a colossal sum at the time. But the lives lost and the community destroyed in the slum next door were, to the world outside, an unfortunate but secondary consequence. The main story for many was the spectacular failure of the vat and the financial hit to the company. 2 days after the disaster, on Wednesday, October 19th, a coroner's inquest was held at the workhouse of the St. Giles Parish to determine the cause of death of the 8 victims. The jury was made up of local tradesmen, respectable men of property. They were taken on a grim tour of the scene of the disaster, viewing the collapsed houses, the flooded cellars, and the immense shattered remains of the great vat at the brewery. They heard testimony from George Crick, the brewery clerk who had first noticed the slipped hoop. He recounted his story calmly and professionally. They heard from the brewery's owners and from some of the survivors who were coherent enough to speak. The central question before the jury was, who was to blame? Was this a case of criminal negligence on the part of the brewery? Was it a faulty vat, a failure of materials? Was some human being responsible for this loss of life? The jury deliberated. Their verdict, when it came, was shocking to modern ears, but perhaps predictable in the context of 1814. They ruled that the 8 victims had come to their deaths, casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. No one was held responsible. The brewery, Moo & Company, was cleared of any wrongdoing. The disaster was officially ruled to be an act of God. This verdict seems baffling, even outrageous today. A piece of industrial equipment failed, killing 8 people, and it was deemed an act of God, an event with no human cause? But it makes a certain kind of grim sense in the context of the time. The legal concept of corporate negligence was in its infancy. The idea that a company had a duty of care to the public, especially the poor public living next door, was not well established. The jury, made up of men who respected the power and importance of industry to the nation's wealth, likely saw the brewery owners not as villains, but as fellow businessmen who had themselves suffered a terrible and unforeseeable accident. The law was designed to protect property and commerce, not the lives of the poor. The brewery itself, having been legally exonerated, was able to move on. They petitioned Parliament for a refund on the excise tax they had already paid on the hundreds of thousands of gallons of porter that were now seeping into the soil of St. Giles. They were granted their request, receiving a tax break of over £7,000. They were essentially compensated by the state for the beer that had killed 8 people. They soon rebuilt the vat, and the Horseshoe Brewery continued to operate on the same site for another 100 years, until it was finally demolished in 1921. The victims, the poor Irish families of the St. Giles Rookery, received nothing. There was no compensation from the brewery, no official apology from the state. Their lives were simply seen as expendable, the unfortunate, unavoidable collateral damage of industrial progress. Their tragedy was quickly forgotten by the wider city. A bizarre and gruesome footnote in the history of London. Part 3. The Echoes of the Flood. Chapter 7. A Tale of Two Cities. The story of the London beer flood is more than just a piece of weird history, more than just a macabre anecdote. It is a powerful and tragic illustration of the central reality of 19th-century Britain. The nation was starkly divided into 2 worlds, the world of the rich and the world of the poor. It highlights the immense power of the new industrialists and the utter powerlessness of the urban working class. The great vat at the Moo Brewery was a perfect symbol of the age. It was a monument to industrial scale, to engineering prowess, to ambition, and to the immense profits being generated by feeding the city's appetites. Its owners were respected members of the establishment, men of wealth and influence. The people who died in its shadow were the invisible, disposable cogs in that machine. They were poor. They were immigrants. They were, in the eyes of the law and of society, of no account. Their deaths were not seen as the result of a dangerous industrial practice that needed regulation, but as an unavoidable, unfortunate act of fate. The act of God verdict is telling. Today we reserve that term for natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, lightning strikes. To apply it to the failure of a man-made object is to absolve all human beings of responsibility. It was a convenient way to close the case, to avoid difficult questions about corporate liability, and to allow the powerful engine of industry to continue its work, unimpeded by concerns for the safety of those who lived in its path. The story also serves as a strange and potent reminder of the raw physical reality of the Industrial Revolution. We often think of this period in abstract terms of steam power, of factories, of economic growth, of statistics and charts. But for the people living through it, it was a visceral sensory experience. It was the constant taste of coal smoke in the back of your throat, the deafening, relentless noise of machinery, the stench of the polluted river and the unsanitized streets, and on one terrifying afternoon in St. Giles, the thunderous roar of an exploding vat and the dark, suffocating tide of 1,000,000 pints of beer. Chapter 8. The Legacy of a Strange Disaster. The London beer flood of 1814 did not lead to any immediate, sweeping reforms. There were no new laws governing the size of brewery vats, no new safety regulations. Life in the St. Giles Rookery, for those who survived, went on much as it had before, in poverty and squalor. The neighborhood would remain one of London's most notorious slums for decades, a place that respectable people avoided, a symbol of the city's social ills. But the story lingered. It became a piece of London folklore, a cautionary tale told in pubs and passed down through generations. It was a story so strange that it almost defied belief. And in its strangeness, it preserved a truth about the city's past. The event did, however, have one long-term consequence. The great wooden vats, which had proven so catastrophically unreliable, were gradually phased out by the brewing industry over the course of the 19th century. They were replaced by lined concrete vats, which were stronger, safer, and less prone to sudden explosive failure. The age of the great wooden beer oceans came to an end. Today, nothing remains of the Horseshoe Brewery or the slum that it destroyed. The Dominion Theatre stands on the site, a place of entertainment and escapism. The narrow, filthy alleys of the St. Giles Rookery have been swept away by modern urban development. But the story of the flood endures, a ghost that haunts this corner of London. It is a ghost that reminds us of a time when beer was not just a drink, but a force of nature. It reminds us of the forgotten lives of Anne Saville, Eleanor Cooper, and the other 6 women and children who were its victims. And it reminds us that history is not just made up of great men and grand events, but also of strange accidents, bizarre disasters, and the quiet, often unrecorded, suffering of ordinary people. The London beer flood of 1814 remains one of history's strangest and most tragic disasters. It was a calamity born of the most mundane of things, a slipped iron hoop on a beer vat. It was a flood made not of water, but of the city's most beloved beverage. And it was a disaster whose victims were quickly swept away, not just by the wave of porter, but by the relentless, indifferent tide of history itself. A story that once heard is impossible to forget. Thank you for joining me on this journey back to the dark, chaotic and beer-soaked streets of Georgian London. The London beer flood is a bizarre and tragic tale that offers a unique window into the past. A story where industrial might and human fragility collided in the most unexpected and devastating of ways. If you found this exploration of one of history's weirdest disasters interesting, please consider supporting our channel. You can do that by leaving a like, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell, so you don't miss our next deep dive into the strange and forgotten corners of London history. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Does the act of God verdict surprise or anger you? What does this story reveal about the human cost of the Industrial Revolution, a cost that is often glossed over in our history books? Let me know in the comments below. We have many more stories to tell, from unsolved crimes to strange phenomena and historical oddities that reveal the hidden truths of our world. Until then, stay curious, question the narratives you've been given, and remember that sometimes the strangest stories are the ones that tell us the most.